Hello and welcome to the Kevin Mannix Report. This is a program designed to give all of us a little more information and insight as to what goes on in government and some of the people who are involved in government procedures and legislation within the state of Oregon. Our guest today is a lady who has been involved in the Oregon Legislative Assembly, particularly the House of Representatives, since she was a little girl. But now she's one of the big cheese over at the legislature. She is the chief clerk of the House of Representatives, Ramona Kenady. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I shouldn't have started off mentioning the big cheese or chief cheese or whatever, but I heard a story from you a while back about what it was like when you were in 6th grade, I think it was.
That's correct.
And since we like to start out with getting some background information about our guests so people will understand more about them as people, can you tell us a little bit about growing up and what it was like to have a dad involved in the legislative process?
Sure. When I was in the 6th grade, my father was successful in his election to the House of Representatives, and that was in 1957. And we packed him up from the family farm that's located just east of Springfield and in Marcola, and moved to Salem. The first session, the family did not move, but subsequent sessions after that, we did move. Anyway, the fortunate thing for me was that as he came to work in the legislature, he brought the family with him on occasion, and I had an opportunity to serve as honorary page. In fact, I found a photograph that was given to me just this last interim of me sitting on the front bench as an honorary page on the opening day of the 57 session. And I've had that framed, and it's now in my office.
Well, that would seem to be a nice memento and a warm memory. Before you ended up in the current position, and we will be talking a lot about that and about the House, where did you go to school? What kind of background did you have in the intervening years before you ended up working full-time with the legislature?
Well, it's not unlike what it is now in that the legislature met every other year. And so every other year, as my father continued to be elected, we would move from Marcola on the farm up to Salem. I attended the Springfield schools when at home, but then when I came to Salem, I ended up attending Parish Junior High and North Salem High. I did get to graduate, however, even though it was a session year, from my alma mater, which is Springfield High School.
Now I've got to pause and ask, what kind of stuff did you do when you were in high school? I mean, you were doing the page work or during the assembly when the legislature was in session, but were you involved in the school activities and that sort of thing?
I was in Springfield some, but it's very difficult, and I've often mentioned this to members who have children and come a long distance about the value of whether you should relocate those children or not. It really was disruptive. It's hard to transfer from your friends and from your school activities when you're engaged in your regular school every other year to be uprooted in January after you've already spent several months in the school process for a year, and then try to interject yourself into a sort of foreign environment by being transferred into the schools here in Salem. So I've often recommended that they try to look to other options, although I think it's important that the families, be connected with the legislators when they do come to Salem, because it is very intense, and the demands on the family is very, very high. But from my personal experience, I think it was best if we got to stay at home.
Well then, yeah, and that would be our friendly advice to legislators and would-be legislators, that as to at least the junior high or mid-high and then high school years, allow that continuity with peers and that sort of development. Because it is tough for 6 months being moved. It's tough enough for legislators to move, but those teen years are pretty sensitive.
Yes.
So there's a little learning there. Well, what did you do after high school?
Well, after high school, I ended up attending Lane Community College, where I spent about a year and a half, and then I ended up getting married. And my husband at that time had gotten an opportunity to attend Western Oregon University. It was then OCE, and that brought us back into this area. Little did I think that at that time I would ever seek to go full employment at the Oregon House of Representatives. I worked at Chemeketa Community College for several years. An opening did come at the Oregon legislature, and since I had been sort of vested in that process all through my entire life, and my father had continued to be elected, I did then get employed in the House of Representatives. I started out as a receptionist and ultimately worked in the leadership offices, the minority office, the majority office, the speaker's office, worked on committees, both as a support person and then as an administrator, and then ended up in the chief clerk's office as the secretary in 1974. At that time, you know, I sort of found my niche. I really enjoyed that process and, you know, the record keeping and making sure that the members were getting what they needed to support them in those avenues. And so I sort of stayed there, and I worked through all the positions in the chief clerk's office, and ultimately in 1985 was elected chief clerk.
Now we have to pause for a moment and reflect on this. It would seem to me that you are, within the political process, the epitome then of, when we think of the old success stories in the business world, the person who comes in and starts working in the mailroom as the mail clerk and then ends up in the offices of the chief executive officer of the corporation. And granted, there are the elected leaders and the political leaders, but we need to remember, too, the chief clerk is technically an elected official.
It is elected.
You are elected by the House of Representatives.
The members of the House, yes.
Well, we might want to talk for a few minutes about the job of the chief clerk, but first I'd want to remark then that this is why you have so much knowledge about how the rest of this process works, because you've been there in all those staff positions.
Yes, I've had an opportunity not only, you know, watch various positions, but also actually do them. And so I think I have a fairly good grasp about what the requirements, particularly of the record-keeping chief, if that's what you want to call it, because it is where the institutional memory is kept. It is the recording of the journals. It's the documenting of all of the histories of the bills. And it's making sure that the constitutional requirements are being met, in addition to the House rules and our parliamentary authority.
Now, in our legislative assembly in Oregon, which is typical of other states, but probably in some respects more efficient and simpler, we've got the House of Representatives and we have the Senate. We have 30 senators and 60 House members. House members elected for 2-year terms, senators elected for 4-year terms. Now, the Senate has a similar position called the Secretary of the Senate.
Correct.
Are her duties, and presently we do have a woman in that position, are her duties parallel to yours, or are there some differences?
I think that it depends on the leadership. I think generally the core responsibilities are exactly the same. I have found that on the House side, and particularly now that we are moving through the members very quickly, term limits, that the responsibilities of the chief clerk have expanded. And I find myself, and welcomingly so, I find myself involved in the recent orientation programs that have been developed to try to make sure that our members are up to speed in a very short time. I'm very involved in the business of the legislative capital. I'm viewed as one of the directors, and I attend a lot of the meetings just in making sure the entire legislative assembly is moving in lockstep to support the membership. And the Secretary of the Senate, Judy Hall, is also involved in a lot of those capacities. She's not been in her position as long as I have, and so I think with longevity you get more and more responsibilities, and the members look to you more and more.
Now, you've also been through some leadership transitions, several of them.
Several.
Since 1985. And there's been a transition, which I give credit to you for this, what I call the professionalization of the job of chief clerk. In olden days, it was seen as something of a political appointment or political selection, usually by the party in power. In fact, I would say almost always, if not always, by the party in power. But under your leadership, you've transitioned the role of the chief clerk to being more as sort of the, I'll say, the chief professional officer of the House, the person who can maintain institutional integrity and continuity, and also make sure that the structure is there to serve the members, and that they can make the policy decisions for the state, but that there's no need to change the operating structure. Is that
yeah, that's
a fair analysis?
I think that the first step towards that was in 1973, when the Democrats did take control in that year. They did bring in a new chief clerk, but I think they became very aware quickly that the persons that they need in those positions are individuals who have some sense about the importance of the record keeping, about supporting the membership in parliamentary procedure, and just making sure the nuts and bolts are in place. And within 6 months, they realized that they needed to bring back the former chief clerk, who had actually been a Republican and a minority leader. And so I think the transition sort of started there. However, in 1983, he was replaced by a Democrat chief clerk under the speakership of Grattan Cairns. And so, that sort of then again politicized the position. In 1985, the Democrats still in control. I was then elected chief clerk. And in 1991, when the Republicans had taken control of the House, I did survive the change in leadership when Larry Campbell became speaker. And although I'd worked for the Democrats for 18 years, I give credit to Speaker Campbell in that he sort of had recognized and acknowledged the fact that on all those years as he'd served as minority leader, that he saw me doing my job in a very nonpartisan way. And my credibility, my integrity of this entire position is based on the fact that the rules are the rules are the rules. And you may not always like the message delivered, but it will be what the rules indicate. And if you want to change the rules, well, then we'll do it differently. But that'll take 31 members to agree with you.
Now, don't be too self-effacing about this. My perception is that you did allude a little bit to this. The transition was smooth, and the move from it being seen as a partisan selection process does have some history, but also when the shift from the Democratic control to the Republican control occurred, you had for so many years established this persona within the position that you sort of redefined the role of chief clerk as not chief partisan functionary, but chief professional for the institution. Sort of akin to the British civil service, in my view, where no matter who's prime minister and who's in the cabinet, there's then the next rank is the civil service, who are there to provide continuity to government. Now, and technically you're up for election in January as by the House, and no one has come forward to challenge you.
Not yet.
But you never take anything for granted
I don't.
until the election is over.
Yeah.
Well, with this change, do you think that we'll still be, and particularly with term limits, be able to maintain this trend towards having some good, solid continuity to the core staff for the House?
Well, that's my hope. And I think that it's incumbent on the staff, particularly, to make sure that the members, as they come into the institution, understand what you do and what your value is. We've sort of, been, my mode of operation has tended to be to sort of stay in the background, support the leaders, because they're the ones that have been elected, and all of the members, and try to support the institution. But I believe that it is now really, really important, that is, particularly this session, we have 27 new members in the House, that they understand what I do and what I can do for them, and why it is important that you have that continuity.
Well, you've been recognized over time now as a quiet, I won't say outspoken, but I'll say a quiet advocate for the integrity of the institution and for an understanding of the needs of the institution as a democratic institution with a small d for the state of Oregon. And I think you've mentioned in the past that Representative Peter Courtney, now Senator-elect Peter Courtney, has understood the needs of the institution. And you mentioned Larry Campbell's sensitivity to this when he was coming into the speakership. Do you see some dynamics where incoming members are now beginning to understand this? We'll talk about this training program and orientation separately, but are the ethics of the institution being understood by the new members? Is it being passed on these days?
Well, again, I think with term limits, the messengers are going to be the staff. And it's hard once they've been elected, because they have no contact with us during the election cycle. That's not how we do it. They're out on the campaign trails. They are being counseled and, have their supporters in lockstep with them. And then upon their election, they then walk into the building and for the first time maybe meet individuals like myself and the other professionals in the building. And so it's difficult for them to even understand sort of what the roles that we play. And, I've likened it to, this is not, as much as we'd like civics classes in schools to really reflect how we do business. It just is sort of the tip of the iceberg, and that it's really not the underlining how the process really, really, really works and what we do to support that process. So again, I'm hopeful that not only that we take it upon ourselves to try to share that, but that as we go into term limits, that they will also look to their predecessors and try to, at least in their own areas, in their own districts, seek counsel as to who is important in the building, what do they do, and how does it all work, because they don't have much time to get up to speed.
We're going to pause for a moment,
Okay.
and we'll talk about some of this orientation in a moment. But I'll mention to our audience that you're with us on the Kevin Mannix Report. Yeah, we know how we came up with that name. I'm Kevin Mannix. I'm your host. And this program is designed to give all of us a little more insight and information about what goes on in government. If you ever have any questions or concerns at any time, you can write to me at the Kevin Mannix Report, 2003 State Street, Salem, Oregon, 97301. If there's some immediacy to your concerns, you can also call 503-364-1913. And we always welcome your insight and comments. But we'll return now to our guest for today, Ramona Kenady. We were just starting to get into the continuity and the new members, and you had alluded earlier to an orientation program for new members, which is an expansion of what's been done in the past. Can you talk a little about that?
Sure. I think that this last interim, and the interim is when we're not in session, and it usually lasts about 18 months. And so for the last 18 months, staff at the Capitol, ongoing staff has really realized that we have to think outside the box. Typically, what we have had is only new member orientation, and it's usually lasted about a day and a half. And that's just not adequate, not when you have 27 new members. And when your senior members have only really had 1 year actual in the trenches experience, because with our term limits, although it's 3 terms, their exposure to the process in the Capitol, in session, is 6 months every other year. So right now, my most senior members have 1 year experience, except for you, who had previous experience prior to the vote of the people for term limits. So with that in mind, I think that we had to think outside the box, and that's what we've done. And we've provided at least 6 days training in the House for returning members and new members. It started in September, prior to the election, with a retreat of the members to talk about the challenges of term limits. They're in charge. They need to decide how they want to proceed. And this was both Democrats and Republicans sitting around and really brainstorming about how can we meet this challenge. We then had a really focused on the nuts and bolts orientation program the day, Monday after the election for new members. Who are their resources? How can they use that? How can they be immediately effective in their positions? And we've not only provided, on-site orientations, but we've sent them home with videotapes and audio tapes and all sorts of written literature, so that depending on how they best absorb information, we've given it to them in every single medium. We just completed, about a week ago, a 3-day program. First day was at Portland State. Really basic civics and the responsibilities in Oregon for the different branches of government, and how do we relate to local and federal governments. We also then did a partnership with Willamette University here in Salem on the art of negotiation. That was very, very productive and successful, following by a mock committee session, and then moving it to the floor, and on Wednesday did a mock floor session. We just completed this last Monday a training for all members on the committee process and what roles they will be playing in that process. Because as you know, the committee process is very, very important in Oregon in that we do not allow for amendments on the floor, and thus they have to be really, really effective in committee.
Well, that's where we need to help the public understand, too, because even in the federal Congress, folks are used to floor fights where there are attempts to add amendments to bills and that sort of thing. And in the Oregon legislature, the tradition is, and the rules are,
Correct.
that if you want to change a bill that's come to the floor out of a committee, the most you can do is either vote against the bill or send the bill back to a committee to be reworked, that you will not amend on the floor. And that means that the committee process is more important politically, but also technically, because those amendments on the floor can get pretty messy, too, in some states, and they have to go back and sew and patch and fill in some holes, whereas at least we have a committee process which can address that. That seems to change the dynamic of our floor debates a little bit compared to other states. But that also brings up a new topic here, which is you've become something of a national figure in terms of state legislatures. And can you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing on the national scene and even the international scene?
Well, I've been really fortunate in that my professional development, this is, as I had mentioned, my schooling was, the traditional schooling. To learn to be chief clerk, I think you really had to be on the job learning as you go. And not very many people in the United States have my position, in that we have 50 states, Nebraska's unicameral. So,
that means they have a single house to their legislature.
Correct. So we have 99 individuals who have a similar position as I do. And so a lot of the professional development comes from a national organization called National Conference of State Legislatures. And the clerks and the secretaries, individuals with similar positions as mine, we get together periodically throughout the year and really learn from each other and get that professional development there. I served as president in 1994 of that organization. I'm currently serving on the executive committee of National Conference of State Legislatures now, and I'm in my 4th year in that position.
Now, you got asked, though, to go out and to help develop a new legislative process, and you want to tell us about that?
Yes, I was really fortunate, and during the last session I got a note that came across my desk, and it happened to be one of those contentious days on the House floor, and I returned to my office to find a phone message saying that I needed to return a phone call that they wanted me to go to Gaza and to the West Bank. And I thought somebody is, having some fun with me here, and that, what would be more contentious than the House floor that day, and probably that would be, the Palestinian Legislative Council and their development. But it was real. I did call back, and I had an opportunity then to travel to the West Bank and work with the Palestinian Legislative Council in their development of a legislature. And they have 88 members. They stood for election. It was a democratic election. And they are now in the process of developing their council. I went in August and returned in late September, so I was there about 6 weeks. I then returned again in February of this last year and was only able to stay about 4 weeks because at that time we were then still having problems with Saddam Hussein, who we are currently having problems with. And actually now dealing with that, but I was seen as non-essential staff and was asked to leave by the State Department. I was supposed to return this last fall. The contract did not get signed, but I am probably going to return after this next session. And the good news for me is I just got a phone call, and some of the Palestinian council members and their newly elected chief clerk are coming to Oregon in February, and we'll be visiting the state capitol and the House of Representatives to see how we do it here. So I have a very strong connection with that development.
I think that's wonderful. It's sort of like Oregon spreading a little bit of its democracy. And I'll say it, our civilized form of democracy in terms of how the state legislative assembly operates to other parts of the world, and you get to be the messenger. It'll be interesting to see if we'll be on our good behavior when the visiting delegation arrives, but I'm sure you'll remind us to be on our toes. As we go through this process, and with the implications of term limits and all of that, do you see further, of course there will be some adjustments, but further shifts in the role of the chief clerk, or do you think we're now getting used to the idea of having, again, I use the term, a chief professional officer for the House, just as there is one for the Senate? Is that something that's starting to solidify a bit?
Oh, I think so. I think that those who have been part of this process weigh in some, maybe different career choice. What I'm trying to come down to say is that, some of the members who have served now are with the executive. Some have chose to go out and get clients and now are lobbyists. So I think that they bring that institutional memory back in the value of all of the professional staff in the Capitol. We have them, not only with the clerk and the secretary, but with our legislative administrator, with the fiscal officer, the revenue officer, legislative council. It's really critical that I think all of those positions are nonpartisan and support the institution and also the membership in trying to give them all their options so that they can be as productive as possible in a very short amount of time. So I think that, yeah, I think we hopefully have come to that. But again, each legislature has its own personality and its own needs and wants to set its own tone. And hopefully we are seen as facilitators as opposed to, you know, roadblocks. And that's our responsibility to make sure that that is the way we are viewed.
It would seem to me that this sense of additional professionalism and nonpartisanship in staff has also lent more of a sense of community that's still growing between the House and the Senate, where my perception early on when I first served in 1989 was that they not only kidded each other, but there was some animosity, and we still had animosity between those two chambers, even among members of the same party. So it's not so much a partisan thing as an institutional thing. But with some of this orientation and some of the programs that have been going on, I also sense that there's some more bonds being developed between the Senate and the House. What's your take on that?
I think you're absolutely correct. That was one of the nice things that I saw, and was one of the things that the staff addressed, in that we tried to look at how did the bodies get along in the 50s and the 60s and what is different now. And I always say, well, we have I-5. And that is really true. A lot of the families did relocate, even if they lived in Eugene or Portland, because there was no easy way to get to Salem. It took a long time, and the roads weren't that good. Now it's very easy to commute between Portland, between Eugene, even sometimes between the coast and you know, the Cascade underlining communities. And so that doesn't keep the members here. As soon as the workday is over, they go home. And, you know, what happened in the 50s and 60s is they stayed locally, and so there was a lot of friendships built outside of the Capitol building.
Which helped people overcome some of the animosities.
And the partisanship, because you may have a really good fight on the floor and come down philosophically on totally different positions, but then you could go out in the evening and maybe have some dinner and have some conversation, and you sort of rebuilt those bridges. And that hasn't been really happening. But what we saw with the orientation programs that were offered is that we really had an opportunity to bring both the Senate and House together, Democrats and Republicans, new members, and seasoned members. And they really, at the first day that we had the training, you could walk in and you could see who was sitting with who, and it was with their best friends. And by the third day, you couldn't guess where they might sit down, because they'd really had an opportunity to get to know these people personally, as opposed to what they'd heard about them philosophically or politically in the campaigns.
Well, then we are seeing a transition from the campaign wars to the armistice of the pre-session time, and we would hope the permanent peace in most respects once session begins, although obviously nothing is perfect, and there will still be some philosophical disagreements. With all of that, I'd like to thank you for joining us on the show and sharing your insight about this whole process. I do want to show you the compliment of it. I've just been totally impressed with the job that you've done these years. And I'm sure the audience will be impressed with you now that they've had a chance to hear you talk about some of these things. I'd like to thank all of you folks for being with us on the show and listening to Ramona Kenady as she talked about her life and her work as Chief Clerk of the House of Representatives. We'll see you again next time. Thanks very much.